My name's Helen Dowding. I'm the Painting Conservator for Bristol Museum and Art Gallery. I trained at the Courtauld Institute of Art in easel paintings conservation, and I've worked in private conservation and in museums ever since. When we approach a painting for treatment, one of the principles we work to is to try and do the minimal intervention that will stabilise the picture and preserve it in the best possible way. Regarding the colour, a lot of how we would think about the colours, how we would think about matching the colours, or how we know whether the colour has changed is based on historical and scientific research and analysis that allows us to go from an informed standpoint to apply practically the best decisions about the treatment. In the past and in the present, a lot of colour matching, for example, with retouching is done by eye, but the body of research behind us means that we can do analysis to find out what pigments were used originally, but you can also make an educated guess if you don't have the resources to do that analysis on the spot. In a museum environment, it's very important that we control the humidity and light in particular while paintings are on display. In oil paintings and the paintings that I work with, there are certain pigments that are less permanent, that are more vulnerable to light exposure than others. So in some paintings you do get areas of fading. It's usually works on paper that are much more vulnerable to light exposure. Watercolours, for example, fade almost completely in some cases, and once that fading has happened, there is no way you can get the colour back. So that's why it's so important that we protect all works of art that are vulnerable, but especially works of art on paper, from the damaging effects of light. To preserve the colour saturation in paintings when they're on display, we control the light levels. So there are maximum light levels that are recommended for oil paintings, for example, and for works on paper, which are much more vulnerable. So maximum of 200 lux for oil paintings, maximum of 50 lux for works on paper. The most damaging part of the light spectrum for paintings is the UV part of the spectrum. So when the pictures are on display, we make sure that we use light sources that have no or very, very little UV, and we also filter any windows that are letting in daylight so that that blocks the UV as well, because that can affect the pigments in the paint, but also the varnish that is on the top. A lot of what we do is removing old varnishes that have turned yellow because of UV exposure or other factors, and that yellow varnish sort of acts as a filter, a yellow filter across the picture. It makes the blues look green, it can spoil all the tonal variation within the picture, so removing that and replacing it with a varnish that doesn't yellow really helps the viewing experience of the painting. Technology and scientific analysis does play a very important part in the conservation of paintings. A lot of the research that is done directly informs what we do in practice. So, for example, with retouching, which is what we do when areas of paint are missing and we fill in those to reintegrate the image, we need to match the colour perfectly. And there are some problems that can occur. One of them is called metamerism, which happens especially with blue pigments. It happens with others, but especially with blues, and that's a problem if you're working on a landscape with a lot of sky, for example. So we could match the colour in the loss under daylight conditions, but then under a different light condition, the match would no longer be good and the two colours would look different. So one way we combat that is by looking at the analysis that's been done via spectrometry that produces the spectral reflectance curves for each pigment. So if you know the pigment that was used originally, you can then find a substitute pigment, if necessary, that has as close a possible spectral reflectance curve, and that should eliminate or minimise the metamerism problem. Although we have all the scientific research behind us that informs what we do and can help us in our decision making, in practice, when you're colour matching for retouching to make those losses to a paint surface disappear, we generally do it by eye, using our knowledge of what the pigments would look like used in that medium or in mixture with other pigments to achieve the final effect.